hiring the right people is everything, but it's not everything if the environment's wrong and the expectations are wrong.
How do you set expectations and find the right person at an early stage company? Like, what goes into that? You don't need to hire the right person, you need to hire a partner. If you don't have a level of trust, those conversations get really difficult.
Hello, welcome to Making Revenue Tick. I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend, Matt Marshall. Matt, how you doing?
Good, man, and thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this one.
Yeah, I know, right? From that first conversation, we hit it off. Around our total obsession around McLaren F1 racing team. Our pre-chat was just F1 talk. But then also that we've both become recruiters.
Yes.
After being on the other side.
100%.
Which has given us a different perspective than kind of coming through the classic, recruitment being the first job we ever did in sales, which I think would be quite interesting for us to talk about this topic. And I know when we were doing our pre-chat, I asked you if we were going to talk about anything together that might reveal some interesting perspectives and experiences that could help people, what would that be? And you told me one line. What was that line, Matt?
Just how do you set expectations and find the right person at an early stage company? Like, what goes into that? You know, it's so important.
Yeah.
And it's so hard. It's so hard. And I do think like finding that person, you don't need to hire the right person. You need to hire a partner, right? Because you're going to be learning through a lot of different stuff. And unless you have a level of trust with said revenue leader, right, you got to be able to have those conversations that are going to be good, hard, happy, like go through all of those emotions together. If you don't have a level of trust, those conversations get really difficult.
It's a good point. It is a good point. Because I know we were talking about like hiring the right people is everything, but it's not everything if the environment's wrong and the expectations are wrong, right?
Correct. Yeah. And like hiring is everything. Like you could have the greatest product and the greatest plan in the history of tech, but at the same time, if you don't hire the right people at the right time for the stage of company that you're in, all of those dynamics put the whole thing together. It's not just having the great product. It's not just having the right people. It's finding the combination of all of these things.
It's so true, isn't it? I remember when we were first launching the recruitment business and we were trying to come up with the value proposition deck and work out our positioning in the marketplace. It was hire the right people in the right positions at the right time. And then I realized actually most recruitment agencies position themselves that way. It's the actual thing that you're trying to do, but everyone kind of talks about it. And what you don't get, in my experience of being in tech sales leadership for 16 years of my career before I started the recruitment business, was no agencies really treated me like that. It was, they wanted my JD and they wanted to be able to then go out to market. They always said they could go and find me the person for sure. And then I had incredibly mixed levels of experience and very often a total lack of understanding of my business and no challenging. I was never challenged in the way that a tech salesperson would challenge me. So it's a completely different process. Like what I know you've come from this background of being a tech sales leader, in quite senior positions. So we'll talk about your history in just a second, but why do you think recruitment is so far behind the industry that we serve of tech sales?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that, for people like you and I that have been on the other side and now on this side, even for me, like in the first 7 months of doing this, I've learned a lot of what it's now like, and not just that, but like the value that as leaders we received back then of just getting the right candidates in front of us. But I also think our experience gives us a unique perspective in when we're working with companies to find leaders or find, ICs, because we have been there and we've actually been in that environment to understand not just what the right person looks like, but the type of person that at each stage a company needs. Because as a company evolves, the type of person changes, right? Like in the beginning, you need grit, you need passion and all that stuff. Then you start working up and you start, all right, now we need a level of experience. But if you haven't sat in those seats, I think you just don't have that unique perspective that you and I do. And I've one of the things that I've had to work on in my first 7 months is my own biases, right? And like, you get a candidate on paper before you talk to them, and you're like, and then you talk to this person, and you go, wow, I was totally wrong. And I think for me, that's been the most interesting, exciting thing of just trying to like work through my own. Would I hire this person? And there is an element of that, but like ultimately, I'm not the hiring manager, and I'm trying to put what I believe are the best people in front of people to kind of put the magic together.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really interesting point. It's such an interesting point because what I had to go through exactly the same journey, and I'm still on it, like really transparently, and I might go through a whole. I might go through an assignment and present a short list of five candidates to a client, who I love all of them. I think that they could be great. Like technically, they fill the brief. I think their characters are perfect. But maybe I've got one or two that I think are really strong. And often it's not the one or two that I think are the best that my client ends up loving the most or that ends up showing the most in the process. And actually, I found the value is the ones I would reject. Like if I would reject someone because they don't pass the sniff test, that's the value. It's not in going, it's this one.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like from now that I'm on the recruit, the search side, that's one of the biggest learnings that I've had. Like I always knew, like as a leader and a hiring manager, like the search folks are filtering stuff out before it gets to the hiring managers, but I had no idea how much volume was being, for lack of better words, filtered before it even got to me. And I think from my perspective, and you with your since we've sat in the seat, I think it gives us the perspective it gives us is potentially to even shrink the filter even further, for lack of better words, to produce the best of the best versus like founders that are so slammed on time anyway, wasting a bunch of cycles with people they never wanted to talk to.
So let's talk about that perspective that we've both got that are kind of shaping our views of the world then, Matt. So talk me through your journey through tech and then this pivot in the last six months into executive search.
Yeah, so I started my first tech role was at a company here in San Francisco called Embarcadero Technologies. They are in the database tools space, that was like 1998, I think 1999. I like to like shrink those numbers a little bit, not admit to myself that I'm the age that I am. But it's funny because when I worked construction to get my way through school, and like I believe that life comes down to just decisions that you make. So at that time, I was interviewing with like a testing ground testing equipment company, and I was interviewing with Embarcadero. And because of my college background with construction, I was leaning towards the testing equipment. And my buddies at the time were like, "Dude, go into tech. Are you an idiot? Like, do not do that." So that was why I ended up making the decision. I started as an inside rep. We were like 20 people. And about a year and a half in, our VP at the time approached me about potentially being a manager. It was time to scale. He thought I'd be great. And my initial response was no. Like, I didn't want to do that, right? I was young. I didn't really want to be responsible for anybody. I just want to go out and have a good time with my friends. But, Walter can be very persuasive. And so I agreed to do it for a year. And if I didn't like it, I could get out. And essentially, I've been doing it ever since. At Embarcadero, before I left, just to kind of round out my overall experience, I did strategic accounts for like 2 years just so I could kind of broaden my whole experience. Then I had a son, so I took some time off. During that time, I was introduced to Lars Dahlgaard, who was the CEO of SuccessFactors at the time. We were talking about building out this, at the time, this new like SDR concept before it became like what it is. And I initially was like,
So when was this, Matt?
It was 2002, 2003. And, I was hesitant because I wanted to stay building closing revenue teams. But there was something about Lars. I just like, man, this guy is super passionate, incredibly smart. Whatever he's doing, something's going to happen. And so I did it. So I built out the SDR team there over like 4.5 years, from like 5 SDRs to about 80 globally. And just really learned a lot. And it's funny because I still am friends with some of those folks that we worked together back then. And it's like, sometimes we talk about, man, like we were just kids. Like we had no idea what we were doing. But that was I really, at each of my stops, I've been so blessed with having just amazing mentors along the way that have like taught me so much that I try to pay that forward now. So I was there for about 4.5 years, saw massive amounts of growth, massive amounts of change. But I knew I didn't want to build SDR teams forever. No offense to SDR leaders, just not what I was interested in. So there was a day where Citrix Online emailed me, and it was the right day at the right time, and I answered. And that was about 4.5 years in. I was living in Boston area at the time. So I flew down to Santa Barbara, met with the Citrix Online team, and just was amazed by the people I met. Super smart, super empathetic. Culture was amazing. So I joined Citrix Online. I inherited a team of about 55 corporate sales reps. Over 4 years, we built that out to about 175, I think, all in, with managers and leaders. Then we moved to a regional model, and I had corporate, mid-market, and enterprise. Did that for a couple of years. And then I was kind of mentally ready to sit in the seat and be a VP of sales. So I joined a company in Santa Monica called Moment Feed. I was there for about a year and a half. Grew revenue from like 3 million to 15 million. But I'm a native Bay Area person, and I had been down in Southern California for like 10 years, and I was just kind of ready to come home. So left Moment Feed, got introduced to Justin Zhu, who was the CEO of Iterable. Him and I just totally hit it off. At the time, Iterable was like 18 people, like 5 salespeople. So moved back up, joined Iterable, was there for about 4.5-5 years. We grew revenues from 2 million to like 75. Company went from like 19 people to 400, and it was just insane amount of growth. So fun. And one of the things I talk about a lot with people is when you're on those journeys, all of the accolades, everything that goes along with that is obviously great, but it's really the bonds that you make with people that last forever. And they can change your career, they can change your life. And so, at each stop, I've made some really good friends. And then from there, I went to a company called Spiff, was there for about a year and a half, grew revenues from like 1 to 7 million. And then went to a company called Emotive, was there for about a year, and then did a couple other stops. But like these last few years have been a little rocky for all of us. But yeah, I mean, I've been doing it for a long time, had some amazing journeys, had some not so amazing journeys. But overall, I think, I've had 4 successful exits, not including Iterable because they're still growing. But yeah, it's been super fun. And I was at a point where I just was ready for a change, and I wanted to be able to take all of my learnings, good, bad, and ugly, and help founders, find the right people, but on the advisory side, just help people and educate people on what I've learned and what I've seen over the last 25 years of things that have worked really well and things that haven't worked really well. So I've been able to instead of drilling in on one company and being focused, I'm able to kind of spread that around, and just, it's been super fun so far. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, me too. I think when you've been through that journey of being an individual contributor, and then you've become a leader, and then you've become second line, and then you're involved in the more strategic side. You've had more visibility of P&L. You just get this huge appreciation for the complexity of it. And I think that all the pain that you go through in each of those stages that you go through in your career, and each of the transitions and the growth periods and the shrink and the pain and the client losses and the people losses, it all just gives you this like a very sort of almost like a spidey sense around spotting problems before they're going to come up, right? It kind of, it's that healthy cynicism, it's that pessimism, but also kind of knowing what you need to go and do to give yourself the best possible chance of being successful. And with people, it's not that you can ever get it right 100% of the time. It's just, it's impossible, right? We're out of control of a bunch of stuff, but there's some really common obvious mistakes that businesses tend to make, which add up to missed targets, unhealthy sales environments, and ultimately failure, which often ends in job loss. Which is really really painful. So let's talk about some of those things. So you've been through this whole journey of being a very successful senior leader within various companies. You've got all these different perspectives. My background's more in agency land. So I started as an SDR, became a team manager, ops manager, business unit director, worked in Auckland, Miami, Barcelona, and the UK as part of a business's growth from like 35 to 450 people, but always agency side. So we had like loads of clients. So we had to learn stuff really, really quick, really, really quickly, and train people super fast to learn value propositions, be able to deliver results, and work with clients' sales teams and deliver revenue and channel services, not good stuff. So we've got probably many more lifetimes of tech experience between us than someone who's just stayed in one company for the whole time. So let's talk about some of the mistakes. When we talk about hiring the right people at the right time in the right positions with the right expectations been the kind of like dream goal that we're going for? In your experience as a leader, as well as now on the other side of the table in recruitment, what are the biggest things that you see being consistently done wrong?
I think, when people hire people they know, I think, and I'm guilty of this too. You probably hire reps that are more seasoned and senior than you really should at an early stage company because you know them. And I think that could give you because they've done amazingly well and you've known them for a long time. I think it can give you a false sense of safety. And so I've made that mistake a couple of times. I think hiring ahead, I think we all have made that mistake of like, all right, we're going to hire 10 reps this quarter and hope this works. And I think that in itself is one of the things that I hope has been kind of recalibrated over the last few years as things have kind of gotten shaky. But I think, the ultimate mistake is just really trying to figure out what is the right number to go after each year, right? It shouldn't be easy. It should be aggressive. But, I myself have been in situations where like I knew the number was next to impossible, and like when I was in board meetings talking about numbers, like I would tell the board, I would tell the executive team, like, look, I just need to be able to see a path to the number, knowing that along the way, trees are going to fall down, sinkholes are going to, like, all the stuff's going to get in the way. I just need to be able to see a path. And I would always work with ops to make sure we had all the data to figure out, like, can we see a path to the number? And if we couldn't, I would just be honest with the exec team and in the board and just say, look, like, I know this is the goal, but like, we can give it a shot, but the data says that number is just not realistic. And I personally believe you're better off building a winning culture than you are chasing numbers that on the sales side, you're missing numbers, but in the company view, because company numbers are lower in most cases, like the exec team celebrating, meanwhile, like the sales team is just suffering. I think you have to figure out what is the right number where everyone feels like they're winning. It shouldn't be easy, but everybody should feel like they have a chance to get to their number and have that winning culture. Because without a winning culture, man, it is tough. It's tough.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And we would have seen all different shapes, sizes, and stages of culture. And I often describe culture as it's like a living thing. You know, businesses that talk about their culture in public, I always find it a bit. You've missed the point. If they're talking about this is our culture, I'm like, actually, every single person that you bring into that team is affecting your culture. And if you let one person in who's against the grain of everything else, then it can just completely destroy your culture in one person. And likewise, if you add the right person, it can raise the game of every single other person in the business. Nothing like a B player in a group of A players to kill the motivation of the group. So I remember like when I was trying to describe culture to candidates in previous like guises and stages of my career, I would talk about culture being it's all about the set of values and beliefs of a community of people. And that's like the sort of Wikipedia answer. And then the old MD in the digital marketing agency I worked at before starting this business said, actually, there's a better way of describing that, which is it's the hearts and minds of the people. And I was like, that's a really good way of describing culture, the hearts and minds of people. So when you talk about winning culture, what's in your mind? What is a winning culture for a sales team?
That so I'll go all the way back to success factors. I learned early on, and like at success factors, we there was a pretty hardcore hiring rule that Lars drove really hard, and we all kind of joined in. Um, at the time, it was a no asshole policy. We changed it to no jerk policy because publicly no asshole is not great. But there was a feeling in at success factors of not necessarily don't let anybody fall behind. It was more of a feeling of if you see somebody getting ready to stumble, grab them and carry them until they can walk again. And I've really tried to carry that with me my whole career because I believe it's one of the reasons why success factors went on to do what it did. We were all in it together. We were all marching to the same beat. There's a lot of debate about the word, family in the workplace these days. I don't necessarily think you're a family, but you do spend more time with people you work with more than anyone in this day and age. So like that, like you have to have, people that can challenge the culture is one thing. People that disrupt the culture, I think that's something else. And the cultures that I try to build is if we make a mistake and let a jerk in, usually the culture will kind of weed those, like move those people out on its own because they're protecting the culture and they're protecting the company. And I think that's when you get it right. Like when everybody's protecting the culture, that's what you need. Like that to me is the ultimate definition of a great culture. When people start trying to protect what's happening inside the company, you know?
Yeah, exactly. It's not top down, right? It's the group, and I think that's massive. In the same way they can be the magnet. It's like really simple things. Like I remember hearing lots of times from candidates. This is when we worked in an office full time. I don't know if you remember those days, but we used to go in 5 days a week, right? And we would have people coming in into their interviews and coming into reception, and they would sit down in the waiting area for reception to either come up for our big like talent presentation or for their interview. And I remember consistently when I asked people why they chose to work for us, which we always did, they would say, I knew from sitting in that reception area that I knew I was going to like the company because about 10 people just asked me how I was and just like came over and started talking to me or just gave me a wave and a smile. So they made their mind up before they'd even had any kind of interaction with the business just because of that environment. It wasn't like we said, right, when people are in reception, make sure you go and smile and stuff. It was just the culture, welcoming people in. And we see a lot of time in clients, and I've seen this loads of times in businesses where there's almost like the opposite of that, which is someone new's coming in and people are going, who's that? who's this? And there's like a threatened kind of thing, which is the absolute polar opposite, right? And what my mind jumps to when you talk about, jerks, often in my experience, that's where someone has been hired because of their history and their experience over their cultural fit. And what I really mean by cultural fit is they just don't have shared values and beliefs. It's all about what they've done, not about who they are, what they want, and what they care about. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. Especially at a small company, like one jerk they can destroy a whole lot of stuff, right? And I think, I've always believed that I could be interviewing the greatest salesperson in the history of selling, but if they're going to disrupt my culture, I'm good. Like, wish you luck, all the best. Because, obviously you want people that can help get to the number, but at the same time, if your culture is broken, you're probably never going to get to the number.
So let's talk about from the search side. So when you're speaking to a bunch of potential people about an opportunity, how are you sniffing out the jerks, the people who will disrupt the culture?
That's a great question. It's difficult, right? It's funny because like when I'm interviewing people now, when I ask them, are there any questions I can answer for you? I have to preface it with saying this is my own bias. For 25 years, I'm used to having all the answers. So what kind of questions can I answer? And I'll do my best, right? Because you don't know. And it's challenging for me because I was so used to like being the hiring manager. I really think it comes down to the kinds of questions people ask, right? And how curious are you? And how, I don't really, I don't expect people to do a ton of research on a company before they talk to like a search person, because sometimes I don't even know who the company is. But I also think that you can tell a lot by the questions that are being asked, right? And, just how they present themselves, you know, but at the end of the day, from a search perspective, we do our best, especially with you and I and the perspective that we have. But at the end of the day, that's going to be up to the founder to figure out, like, can this person fit with our culture?
For sure. I'll tell you from my perspective.
But I do my best.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I know you would do an amazing job because you've seen so many different salespeople and you've hired so many people. From my experience, I think one of the things that's a really good test, and it's like that classic thing, like how does someone talk to the cleaner? How does someone talk to the receptionist? You kind of get like a steer of what they're like, because there are a lot of people who are really good at talking up, but then they have this kind of like horrible I am better than people culture, which is just destroys everything. Now, if you don't work in an office environment, it's harder to spot those things, but often it's them talking to us, right? So, for example, if I'm in a process and I'm talking to a candidate and I have to chase them constantly. There's like short answers. They're never turning out prepared. There's no excitement in the way that they're approaching the process. After all, we're hiring salespeople, right? So it's a game. It's the psychology. It's fun. It's the great people see it as this a chance to innovate and be creative. And the ones that light up when they talk to you about like what they've done, a webinar that they found or a podcast they found that they studied to go and get a steer on what the company's like, you're like, this is amazing. But the opposite of that is if you're having to chase, you're having to remind people, you're having to check in with people constantly, you're having to correct mistakes, all these little signs that show that they lack that care. If they're going to be like that with you, whilst they might not be like that with your client, it very quickly will reveal itself to be the way that they are. In your experience, what are some of the massive green flags you've got where you're speaking to a candidate and through the process they're just showing you a few things that are making you go, this person is special?
On the AE front, like when you are walking the balance line of being aggressive and being overly aggressive, like knowing that line, I think is a great sign, because it kind of gives you a preview of what they're going to be like with customers as they're trying to close deals. The other thing that I think has been interesting for me, and I'm curious to know if you've experienced this as well, since you and I have been on the other side, I find that, like, when I'm talking to salespeople, I just feel like they trust me more because they know I get it, right? Because I've lived that life. I haven't just been a search person. I've done what they are doing. So I feel like there's an element of like, okay, Matt gets it. So I'm just gonna like lay it out there. And I think that's what I respect that, right? Don't let's not hide things or like, you know, I can tell you I get it, right? I've lived your life. I've done it for a long time. And like I think that to me, with the unique perspective that we have coming from that side, it also gives us an ability to have, I think, deeper conversations with candidates because we do get it.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. And they can tell, right, from the questions that you ask them, how you respond to their questions. You're not just going through a list of HR approved
Right,
questions that you have to ask to
right,
go and fill out your CRM system.
check
It's
one,
you're
check
asking
two.
questions because you're curious and it kind of makes sense. And I suppose
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. And then the other side of it is we're not asking stupid questions. And I think
no,
that candidates are so used to, I hear this all the time, they're so used to being asked dumb questions. And what I
yes,
mean by that is questions that clearly show the person doesn't know what they're looking for. And it frustrates people because
yes,
they're supposed to be experts. And I think there's just kind of an expectation that people are they're just doing the rounds. And what it really feels like to people, and you tell me if you've had this feedback too,
yeah,
people feel like they're being screened. Who wants
yes,
to be screened, right?
nobody,
We want to be
nobody.
understood. But it's so common, isn't it? Just that people screen.
Yeah, to say when I have those conversations, I try to like just be like, okay, look, we've got to go through the quota and achievement question. So let's just burn through that really fast so we can actually have a conversation, right? Like I got to get to the check marks so then we can have a real conversation.
Yeah, good point. Now, this is let's just talk about underperformance, right? Because it's very rare to meet a founder or a sales manager who is happy to hire reps who have been under target. But the data shows us, and we've been through these cycles, that 39% of sales teams are hitting quota, which means that 61% aren't. And you know that most resumes show that everyone was over target and it's got all their percentages and it's got everything was wonderful. We know that that's not the reality. So in this market where it's impossible, not impossible, but it's not the case that everyone's going to be over target all the time for a number of different reasons. How do you spot the diamonds who might have had some poor periods of performance in their history?
Um, that's a great question. So one of the questions I try to ask is, if I sense that in the conversation, this person, especially if you go and they had a couple of runs where they did really well, and then all of a sudden, like achievement wasn't there, like I'll just ask them, like,
Mm.
what happened? Like let's just talk about it. And then like, okay, so you had 10 people on your team, cool. Like where did you stack up in regards to those 10? Were you still at the top? Were you in the
Yeah.
middle? And just try to get a little deeper and a little bit more curious about, because like everybody has a story, right? And
Yeah.
if it's performance that everybody was down in your company, then that's a little different than everyone else made it and like two people didn't. Um, so I try to like get
Yeah.
a better understanding because, as you know, like not every product out there is going to blow it out of the water, and not every company is. So it's like there's a lot of
Sure.
situational stuff that kind of goes into what sales folks have to live with and go
Yeah.
through. And sometimes people just don't pick the right fit for themselves, and it shows.
Exactly. Like relationships, right?
Right.
This is
Exactly.
what I always think is like,
Yeah.
people talk about you don't want these shorts you people don't want short stints because people are job hoppers. And I'm like, a lot of people have picked really bad partners. And you went into that with full of hope. And you might have been in that relationship for 6 months before you realized. But you made the mistake. Like it's so obvious, it's so common that people make a mistake. And what I love to do exactly like what you said. Love to stack rank. We had Meredith on the podcast, who obviously introduced us, which Meredith is a champion of the pod. Shout out Meredith. Um, but she talked about asking stack ranking questions, which I love. I think the other thing for me is, where do they attribute blame? Are they taking accountability, or are they saying, well, it was because the market, because my manager, because this thing? It's like, is the story they're telling you rooted in growth mindset, rooted in learning, rooted in they've taken something from it as a learning experience because it's a failure, right? So you have to have learned from it, or is it a a I was a victim of the circumstance?
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting because I think this, like, it just goes back to our experience and the perspective it can give us. I, after all of my years, I have never in the history of my career had a salesperson go, you know what, Matt, you're right. You should do this because I'm just not good. I wasn't great for this. It's not a good fit. Like, that never happens, right? Because there's ego, there's confidence, there's all those sorts of things. But there are stories, right? Everybody has a story, and I think you have to really understand what their story is to get a truer sense of, if you, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, like, if you're looking for people that haven't hopped around a little bit in this world we're living in, you're going to have a hard time potentially finding people, just because, like, the world has changed a lot. And with the economy getting shaky a few years ago, like, I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that hasn't had a couple of 1 years here and there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Might be, but it might not be.
Totally agree. Let me ask you a question that's burning in my mind. So we've talked about the last 3 years being really difficult. We've talked about underperformance being quite common, and we talked about expectations and targets might even be just be completely unrealistic, and no one can hit them, even if the company's celebrating, because all of the fat that's been built into the process. So a question I've got is, a lot of clients through years of conditioning have been conditioned to think the open for work banner means they're no good. Only bad salespeople get fired. The best salespeople always stay. What's your view on the green banner?
That is yeah. I actually have not. So I've seen quite a few posts on it lately. I haven't really thought about it. I don't like. I don't judge people on that. I think in this day and age, like, it's like you hear these stories of, people submitting their resume and 500 other people have submitted their resume. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I don't think that there's anything right with it. I think it's just, it is what it is. And if that's the way you want to advertise yourself, more power to you, right? I think people like to judge. They're quick. People are quick to judge, and I think that everybody, like I said, everybody's story is different. Everybody's situation is different, and you don't know what someone's going through until you ask them, right? And, like, I've heard people looking for roles now for like 2 years. And you just don't know. You don't know what they're going through. So if you want to know what they're going through, just ask them, right? Everybody needs a little help every now and then, and that's okay.
For sure. I came from a culture where it was seen as a negative. In the business I worked at, like, you were looking for people who were in role, particularly for the more senior management roles, leadership roles, and then top individual contributor roles. Obviously, less so for SDR. But we were taught it was negative. That was the way we were taught. And then what I realized is it's a ridiculous way to think, because and then my old CEO had a completely different way of thinking about it. He preferred to hire people that weren't in work because it was much less risk for everyone. And I was like, that's an interesting perspective. So his view was, for someone to leave a company, serve out their whole notice period, potentially move for that opportunity, all the changes that causes. If I can find someone who is the right fit and is available, so it's less risk for everyone, I see that as a positive. And that's a completely different perspective from everything that I've taught before. But I also know that a lot of clients just see that as a very negative thing. My advice when I'm talking to candidates is, treat it like a marketing campaign. So you're out there doing your search, or you're thinking about doing your search, rather than saying, I don't want to do it or I do want to do it, run it as a test. 2 weeks, 1 week, run it as a test and see what impact it has on terms of the number of people that are reaching out to you. Because it does flag up in LinkedIn to recruiters that you're available. So it was bound to go and get you some exposure to people who had never seen you before. What I do also know, and maybe this is my bias, if I see the same person with an open for work banner when I go and do one search, and then maybe 3 months later, I do another search, and then 3 months later, I do another search, and I see the same person, in my mind, I'm going, well, why hasn't that person found something just yet? And I know I don't truly understand it always, but if it's there for too long, I think it could be it could be a negative thing. But I think running it as a campaign and treating it like an experiment is a healthy way to look at the process.
I think your idea of it is a marketing campaign is brilliant, because that's really what it is. If you think about it, at its core level, you're trying to get the word out there. I think, like, and this kind of
Yeah.
goes back to, like, in the last 7 months, like, I really have to, like, work through my own biases when I'm like, and like, there's been a couple of incidences where I've had someone put a time on my calendar. I've looked at their experience. They like, looking at the picture, it looks like there's been some hopping around, and I'm like, all right. Then I have a conversation, and I learned that in one case, the entire sales team got let go. Another case where an entire team got let go.
Yeah.
So there are circumstances that have people have no control over that, until you dive in and ask some questions, you're not going to know. Like, everybody has a story. You never know what the story is until you ask.
We have to have that. We have to have that view, and like you say, when you ask the right questions, it creates that level of trust because you're taking the time to understand them. And humans' greatest need is to be understood. But also, we have to understand clients and their flaws because it could well be, particularly if we're working with earlier stage startups, they have made mistakes. They have, like you said, hired from their network first. They've hired people that they've worked with before, and they've definitely been through periods where they've set the wrong targets. They've been struggling to work out their ICP. They've hired too fast. They've overhired. They've made product mistakes. There's all these different things that can happen. And I think our ability to really understand with clients the journey they've been on, the learnings they've been on, and if they have a growth mindset, because there's no point in us spending all that time really understanding what candidates are looking for, and then we're working with a client who's like, we are perfect. If there's a mistake, it's their fault, and we're going to be putting people into an environment where they're going to be really unsuccessful. When you're speaking to clients and prospective clients about working with them, what are some of the red flags that would mean that you would turn down the business?
When you get that sense of, we're perfect, we're the greatest company, we have everything going for us, like, those are statements that I'll kind of double click on to get a deeper understanding. I like to understand, especially on the revenue side, like, what is the percentage of your, I mean, and these are kind of normal questions, but I'll double click on them. It's like, well, okay, you have a team of 7 salespeople. How many of them are hitting numbers? Why are they hitting numbers? Why aren't they hitting numbers? Like, and just really try to understand where they are in their evolution, because I think where a company is in its evolution says a lot, right? It could be the goal, like the sales quotas are too aggressive. It could be growth targets are too aggressive. Maybe they're too low and the sales team is blowing it out. Then what, right? Like, there's arguments on both sides of the fence to try to figure out where on the fence should they be balancing, because it is a balance. You're constantly like, and just really trying to get an understanding of what, why, and how are things happening. Like, okay, so you think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. Amazing. Tell me why. Like, why do you think you're having this growth? What is the value you're solving? And, just get a real understanding, especially if it's a founder hiring. Who are you as a person? Like, what kind of people are going to jive with you? Because if you're not at a point where you're hiring a sales leader, you still need those reps to have a bonding relationship, because they're going to be on the front lines and you're going to want them to come with you with sometimes great information and sometimes information that you might not necessarily want to hear, but you need to hear it because that's how you learn. Right. And I think at Iterable, we had that where it was open feedback all the time. Right. And Justin, when it came to the product, Justin was open minded. He heard everyone's opinions. Sometimes he didn't agree. Sometimes he did agree. But like, if you don't have that level of trust, you can't, it's harder to solve problems, especially as you're growing at 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, they have all the information, right? It's like that book, David Marquette, Turn the Ship Around. And it's like all the people who have all the information don't have the decision-making power, and all the people that have the decision-making power don't have the information. And particularly in earlier
Exactly.
stage businesses, you need that trust in your team to be bringing you back the truth. And I think that I saw a post on
Yes.
LinkedIn earlier, and it really reminded me of something that I thought about a long time ago, and I really felt the cultural impact of this, which is I was taught quite early on that we only want people to bring us problems if they have a solution. And
Yeah.
I like love this, like help people to become self-sufficient, teach a person to fish, all that stuff. I loved it. But then
Yeah.
I realized the culture it creates is that people don't want to bring you problems
Right.
because they don't know the solution. And it
Right.
creates this thing where they hide things. And actually, the best time to catch a frog is when it's a tiny little baby, lovely frog, not when it's this
Absolutely.
giant, horrible toad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love asking questions about that, about problems that have been faced. Who spotted it? What did you do about it? You told me about this period where you missed this quota, or you had to let this part of your team go, or this person didn't work out that you placed a lot of faith into. What happened? Like, how did you deal with that? How was that communicated? What was the reception of people like? Why are you now ready to rehire? What's different about this now? And I think that when you understand that they're all just going through a process, we're all just people trying to do the best that we can. But some people have such blinkers on that they're not like concluding that it was they had any kind of responsibility. It was they got something wrong and it's their fault, as opposed to what we did is this, and that sort of approach. I love working with people that have that kind of mentality, because it's the hardest thing in the world to work in a startup sales environment. But being an entrepreneur who's created that business from scratch, you're going to make so many mistakes along the way. It's impossible to do it right all the time.
Being a founder, like I've never been a founder, but I've worked with some, and like it's like the best of both. It's I don't even know. It's like you can have all the glory of being a founder and building your own company, but at the same time, it can be the loneliest job on the planet, and it's pressure filled. And like, to bring it full circle, when we first met and talked about this, that's why I said like hiring is everything, because you have to have that as you're growing. Like you have to have people that are willing to come and talk about, look, I'm out there trying to sell this thing. This is what's happening. We got to talk about it. Because if you don't, you're never going to know that problem's out there, and you're never going to be able to solve it because you don't know it even exists. And I think that from a startup perspective, if you think it's going to be smooth sailing the entire time, you really need to rethink your strategy, because like you can have the best product on the planet, you can have all of these things, but there's still going to be bumps. There's always going to be bumps. And to your point earlier about getting that sense, like when things are working and things are rolling, people have the magic ability to peek around corners and see what's coming. And like, let's prepare. Okay, I see this mirror. It's pointing down that street. We should prepare for that car, because I don't know if that car is going to stop. When you're in that groove and you're in the flow, people have the ability to kind of like predict and see the future a little bit versus slogging through the mud and going day by day. Like, I think that's where it's just, you have to have the right people that are going to slog with you and not jump ship.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, I think that this is we could definitely talk all day, and we should definitely do a separate podcast on our lovely McLaren F1. But I think it's a lovely point to end this first podcast. So I wanted to thank you so much. I know that when Meredith connected us, it was like, look, Richard, I think you'll get on really well with Matt, because he's come like you from sales leadership background into recruitment, and I love meeting peers from the industry because it's not a it's not like a black and white thing that
Right.
we're competitors and we're taking each other's pie. This is a massive, massive, massive market. There's
Yes.
27,000 tech sales recruiters in the US. There's 23,000 in the UK.
Yeah.
There's a lot of us.
Yeah.
And we've seen the pain of working with quite poor ones. So I can tell everyone that if you're looking for North American go-to-market executive level of quality people in your organization, you should definitely speak to Matt. And if you're looking for people in EMEA in this similar role, then
they can
we'd
find
love to have
you.
a conversation with you. But Matt, I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Absolutely. Between us, we can solve everything, right, Matt?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And if we can't, we'll be honest about it.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much, Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think we should do another one of these very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.